Odell didn't ask me to remember the name. He asked the doll, too. On my third night with Odell Fenn, he handed me an old wooden doll. He asked me to hold very still while he whispered a name into its collar. It wasn't his name. It wasn't his late wife's. It wasn't anyone's I'd ever heard him mention twice.
Hers now, not yours to ask.
My name is Callie Renner. I sit overnight hospice shifts for a home care agency 2 counties over. It's the kind of work where you learn a stranger's whole remaining life in a matter of weeks, sometimes days. Then you pack your bag and never see the house again. Most nights, it's just the ordinary rhythm of the job. Medication schedules, turning a patient to keep the bed sores off. The low company of a television left on, just for the sound of other people's voices in an otherwise silent house. I'd done 3 years of it by the time I got assigned to Odell Fenn. I walked up his porch steps that first evening with my bag over my shoulder, thinking I already knew every shape this kind of ending could take. He was 86, congestive heart failure, a prognosis measured in weeks by the time I met him. He lived alone in the same low riverbend house he'd been born in almost 9 decades earlier. You could see the additions in the walls if you looked. One room built onto another across generations, like the house itself had been raised the same slow, patched-together way a family gets raised. The agency's intake notes called him pleasant, cooperative, mild confusion at night. They didn't mention the doll. Nothing in 3 years of intake notes had ever once mentioned a doll. I know now that's not because it never came up. It's because nobody who'd sat with him long enough to notice it had wanted to be the one to write it down. The doll sat on his nightstand every night I worked. It was closer to his pillow than his water glass or his call bell. Angled always, so it faced the bed rather than the door. 10 inches, maybe, carved from a pale wood gone honey-colored with age. The features were blunted rather than sculpted, not a face so much as the suggestion of one. The kind of shape a very patient hand makes when it isn't trying to capture anyone in particular. A single glass button, sewn on crooked, stood in for an eye. The other side had only a small round scar in the wood where a second button had once been. The thread around it was long gone. Someone had dressed it long ago in a strip of soft linen. It still carried the faint shape of having once been something else. A hem, a collar, a christening gown cut down for a smaller, quieter purpose. It smelled, when I got close enough to straighten his blankets, of dried lavender, and something mustier underneath, like a drawer that's been shut a very long time and only opened for the one thing kept inside it. I assumed that first week that it belonged to a grandchild, forgotten on a visit and kept out of sentiment. The way old people keep a great deal out of sentiment. I was wrong about that. The same way I turned out to be wrong about almost everything I assumed in that house. One quiet correction at a time. I asked his daughter about it the first time she came by to help with groceries. She sat with her father a while, the way families do when the weeks start running shorter than anyone says out loud. Marlene Whitcomb laughed, a little embarrassed. The way people laugh about a family habit they've never once had to explain to an outsider before. Because until now, no outsider had ever stayed close enough, long enough, to need it explained.
That's older than any of us. My grandmother's doll, Dad's grandmother, Odessa Fenn. She was the midwife around here for the better part of 30 years, before there was a hospital close enough for anybody to bother driving to. Every baby she delivered got one. You gave it the baby's real name, quiet, just between the two of you before the christening. The public name, the one on the certificate, the one everybody called the child, didn't matter as much. That was just what you called them so the wrong thing couldn't find them by their true one first.
She said it fondly, like a recipe passed down through the women in a family, not like a warning anyone had ever needed to repeat twice. I asked, carefully, whose name Odell had been giving it lately. It clearly wasn't a newborn's turn anymore, and hadn't been for a very long time. She didn't have an answer for that. She said her father had always been sentimental about that old doll, more than anyone else in the family ever was. She'd stopped asking him why sometime around her own childhood. Sentimental didn't cover what I started hearing at 2 and 3 in the morning. Those are the hours when the house goes so quiet you can hear the refrigerator 2 rooms away. Odell talked in his sleep most nights. That's ordinary enough at the end. The agency trains you not to read much into it. I'd sat with a dozen patients who murmured through their last weeks without any of it meaning more than a tired mind running loose. What wasn't ordinary was how consistent it was with him. Always the same low, private register. Always addressed toward the nightstand rather than out into the room. And always names, not his wife's, not Marlene's, or the grandchildren's, whose names I'd learned off the photographs lining the hall. Names I never heard him use twice. In a voice that, and I want to be careful here because I know exactly how it sounds, didn't always land quite like his own voice landing. A half beat off sometimes. Like a second person finishing his sentence a fraction of a second after he'd already started it. Patient about it, in no hurry to catch up all the way. I stood in that hallway more nights than I logged. I told myself it was the house settling, the old pipes, my own tired ears playing tricks after a long shift on too little sleep. The lavender smell was always a little stronger on those nights, thick enough to notice from the hall with the door shut. I never had a better explanation than that, so for a while, I let it be the pipes, because the alternative wasn't something I had a place to put yet. The first time I actually saw him do it, rather than just hear it through a closed door, he wasn't asleep at all. He was sitting bolt upright at 3:30. The doll was held to his ear like a man waiting on a phone line to finally pick up after too many rings. When I asked if he was all right, he didn't jump the way a confused old man startled in the night should have. He just held up one finger, patient, listening to something I couldn't hear, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way people look when they're concentrating on a sound rather than a sight.
She's asking again.
I asked who. He looked at me like the question itself was the strange part, like I'd asked him to name the person on the other end of a call he could plainly hear ringing.
Say the name you gave me.
I heard it clearly enough in that thin, borrowed-sounding register that I checked twice. I looked at the little bedside radio, and I listened downstairs for whether a television had carried up through the vents. Neither. The house was as silent as it ever got. Odell just set the doll back against his pillow, gently, the exact careful way you'd lay down something that might still wake if you weren't gentle enough about it.
Go sit down, Callie, let me sleep.
I did. I didn't sleep the rest of that shift, and I stopped telling myself it was the pipes. Marlene finally told me the rest of it a week later, unprompted. She was sorting through a box of her grandmother's papers she'd pulled down from the attic while her father slept off a bad afternoon. Odell Fenn's own first delivery, decades before she ever carried a midwife's bag professionally through this county, had been a nephew of her own. He lived 4 days and was never given the chance to be christened at all. The custom, Marlene said, started right there. Odessa's own private grief made practical, turned into something she could hand every frightened young mother afterward, instead of just a shared silence at the kitchen table, a place to hide a child's true name from whatever had taken the first one, until the christening made a safer, public name official in front of the whole church.
She always said it the same way to new parents, word for word, the same little line every time. For families who can't bear an empty chair twice. Dad had an older brother who didn't make it before he was born. That's who the custom was really for in this family, before it was ever for anybody else's children.
I asked as carefully as I could manage, without sounding like I was asking for a reason I couldn't say out loud. Whether Odell's own milk name was the one he'd been giving away at night now, decades later, to no one that either of us could see. That was the word she used for it, milk name, an old-fashioned term she seemed faintly surprised I hadn't heard before. She said she didn't see why it would matter anymore at his age, with the christening 70-some years behind him and nothing left to protect. I didn't have an answer for why it might still matter. Not yet. I only knew, standing in that attic light with her grandmother's handwriting spread across the table between us, that I wanted one. His decline that last week wasn't gradual so much as it arrived in steps, the way the agency had told me to expect, and I'd still never quite gotten used to watching happen to a person I'd come to genuinely like. cranky mornings and all. What changed alongside it was his relationship to the doll. Less whispering now, more gripping. Both hands, knuckles gone pale around it. Like a man holding a railing on a boat that wouldn't stop pitching under him no matter how hard he held on.
I want it back. Whatever I gave her all those years ago, I want it back now. Before I go, I want it back.
I asked what he meant, keeping my voice as even as I could over the sound of his oxygen. He looked at me with a clarity that frightened me more, in that moment, than any of his nighttime confusion ever had.
You don't give a name away and get old still thinking you're owed the return of it. I was a fool at 6 years old, doing what my own mother told me to do, and I'm a bigger fool now, still hoping it counts for something to ask twice.
I didn't understand him yet, not the full shape of it. I understood him completely 2 nights later, sitting in the same chair, watching the same hands try the same thing one last time. On what turned out to be his last lucid night, Odell asked me to help him sit all the way up. Then he asked me to bear witness while he tried, one final time, to take it back. Not the agency's nurse, not his own daughter. Me. I think by then he'd decided I was the only one left in that house willing to admit out loud what she was actually hearing.
I'm giving you nothing else, do you hear me? Whatever else you were waiting on from me, that's finished. I want the first one returned before I go.
He said his own boyhood name into the doll's collar. It was the name Odessa must have given it for him nearly 80 years earlier, before his own christening. He said it slow and deliberate, like a man reading his own name off a form he wasn't entirely sure was still valid or still his to reclaim.
Say it again.
It came back in his own boyhood cadence, a half beat behind him, patient and entirely unhurried. Like something rehearsing the shape of a request it had no intention, none at all, of ever granting.
That isn't an answer. That was never an answer, not the first time I asked and not now.
He said the name a second time anyway, and a third. His voice grew thinner and more frightened each time. His grip on the doll tightened past what I thought his hands still had strength for. And I understood, watching him, that whatever this arrangement had always been, it had never once, in 79 years of quiet whispering, offered to give a single thing back. It only ever asked, patiently, endlessly, to hear the debt repeated one more time. He died a little after 4 that morning. Quietly, the way hearts finally give out when they've been failing on schedule for months. Nothing sudden, nothing the agency would have called unexpected. Nothing that would ever appear as anything but natural on whatever paperwork followed. I'd been holding his hand since a little before 3. I want to be clear about that, because everything that came after feels stranger than it should for how ordinary his actual death was. He went the way we'd all been told he would, on almost exactly the timeline his own failing body had already written for him. Weeks ago, before I'd ever heard the word milk name. The doll sat through all of it exactly where it always sat, facing the bed. For a long moment afterward, in the particular stillness a house gets right after someone's died in it. A stillness with a texture to it, almost like the walls themselves are holding their breath along with you. I could have sworn the air held that same listening quality. The same one I'd felt outside his door at 3 in the morning, more than once that month. Then it passed, the way any strange feeling passes when there's practical grief work waiting, and it was just a quiet room again. A doll, and a man who wasn't breathing anymore. The house filled with family the next afternoon the way houses do, casseroles crowding the counter. Cousins nobody had seen since the last funeral standing awkwardly in the kitchen. Marlene directing traffic through her own grief. The doll was already wrapped and set carefully inside an old fireproof document box on the coffee table. Like everyone in that family already knew, without ever quite saying it aloud to one another, that it belonged sealed away more than it belonged out on a shelf where a grandchild might pick it up.
This isn't the first time it's gone in a box like this, you know. Grandma sealed it up once herself after her own mother passed. My uncle had it resealed again sometime in the 70s, after a move nobody in the family talks about much. It always comes back out again somehow. Someone always finds a reason to open it.
She said it like a piece of harmless family trivia. the same easy, affectionate tone she'd used telling me about the custom itself weeks earlier. Not like a pattern that should have worried anyone in that room. I didn't say anything back. I was already thinking, instead, about the loose thread I'd noticed at the poppet's back seam while I helped her wrap it that morning. A seam that had clearly been opened and resewn more than once by more than one unsteady hand, over more years than I wanted to count on my fingers. I found myself alone with the box for 10 minutes that evening, technically still on shift, technically just tidying belongings the family hadn't gotten to yet. I told myself that's all I was doing when I worked the loose seam the rest of the way open with a fingernail under the kitchen light. Sewn flat against the inside of the doll's torso, folded small enough to hide under a thumb's width of stuffing, was a strip of cloth, soft and gone thin with handling. Dozens of names covered it, edge to edge, in dozens of different hands. Careful copperplate from an older century, a hurried pencil scrawl, a child's uneven print pressed hard enough to nearly tear the fabric. Most were plainly infants' milk names, exactly the kind Marlene had described to me over coffee. They were dated across a span that ran back well before Odessa Fenn could ever have carved this particular doll with her own hands. That told me, with a small cold certainty, that this was not her first ledger of names, only the one still in circulation. But not all the names were children's. Some sat beside a grown man's full name and a short, plain note scrawled in the margin, the kind you'd only jot down in a real hurry, right before leaving somewhere you weren't at all certain you'd come back from. One line in a hand faded almost past reading said only *T. Calloway, 1944, asked her to keep it safe till he came home. *. Nothing else beside it. No later note in any hand saying that he ever did. I kept reading longer than I should have. Longer than any reasonable person tidying up someone else's grief has any business reading another family's private cloth. Near the very end of the strip, a run of maybe a dozen entries broke entirely from the pattern I'd gotten used to. No dates. No margin notes, all of them in the same unfamiliar hand, small and even and unhurried. Nothing like Odessa's looping script or any of the other keepers' handwriting scattered across the rest of the cloth. Read one at a time, alone, they were only names. The way any name is only itself until you put it next to another one. Read together, in order, in the low kitchen light with the rest of the house gone quiet around me, they stopped sounding like a list. They started sounding like fragments of one long sentence, still being assembled, word by borrowed word, out of everything the doll had ever been handed across, however many decades this had gone on. I could feel, more than understand, where that sentence was heading. I felt it before I let myself read far enough to finish it. I didn't finish it. I told myself it was late, that my eyes were tired after a night with no sleep in it, that I had a box to reseal properly, and a house full of grieving family upstairs who trusted me to be doing exactly that and nothing else. I folded the cloth back along its own old, soft creases, careful not to add a new one, and I did not look at it again. I never told Marlene what I'd found sewn into that seam. I closed it myself that same night, badly, with a needle borrowed from her sewing kit. My stitches would never pass for Odessa's neat original work. I said nothing at all while Marlene latched the box in front of me and wrote out a gift tag for it in her own careful, looping hand at the kitchen table.
You sat with him more nights than any of the rest of us managed to at the end when it counted. He'd have wanted you to have this for keeping him company when we couldn't.
I told her that really wasn't necessary, that it should stay in the family. She insisted anyway. It was the particular way people insist on kindnesses in the middle of grief. Refusing one, right then, feels crueler somehow than simply accepting it and saying thank you. I took the box home with me that night, in the last hour of an already long shift. I told myself, driving back with it sitting sealed and quiet on my passenger seat, that a locked box in a closet was no different from any other locked box in any other closet. Odell's, his grandmother's, whoever came carefully before either of them. I did not yet believe, not all the way, that being handed something is not at all the same thing as being asked, freely, to keep it. I put the box on the top shelf of my own closet, behind winter coats I don't often wear even in the coldest months. I have not opened it since the night I sewed that seam shut. Some nights I do the ordinary last rounds of my own apartment before bed, the same small rituals, checking the same locks, that I used to do for other people's houses before I ever did them for mine. And I catch myself standing in that doorway a beat too long. I feel that same listening quality settle into the air, the one I felt in Odell's room the morning he died. Something patient on the other side of a latch, waiting only, endlessly, to be spoken to.
You never gave one.
I say that back to it out loud sometimes, to no one, just to hear for myself how true it still is. I have not said my own name to that box. Not once. Not even the small, ordinary way you might name a pet you never quite asked for and can't bring yourself to send away. I intend to keep it that way for as long as I'm the one holding the only key. Some nights that intention is the only thing in the apartment that feels entirely mine. If someone in your life ever hands you a name to keep safe, don't take it past your own front door. And if you want to know what happens, eventually, to the ones who do, stay close.